You've been out here 2 hours. Why don't you come inside? I have something for you.
The Buick had been dying for 3 weeks before it finally gave up for good, and it chose Selah Monroe's driveway on a Saturday morning to do it, which was how Bishop Calloway ended up on his back underneath it with grease on his forearms and his daughter's bicycle abandoned in the grass beside him. He hadn't planned on spending his one day off elbow deep in someone else's transmission fluid, but he'd heard the engine turn over and die 3 times in a row from his own porch, and something in him, the same instinct that made him good at his job, hadn't let him keep drinking his coffee and pretend he hadn't noticed. By the time the sun had climbed high enough to throw gold across both their yards, he'd traced the problem to a belt and a battery connection corroded past saving, and Selah Monroe was standing over him holding 2 glasses of sweet tea like she wasn't sure whether he was a neighbor or a miracle. "You didn't have to do all this," she said, and he told her the truth, that he hadn't minded one bit. She looked at him for a second too long, then said the thing that would end up meaning more than either of them expected. "Well, you've been out here 2 hours, least I can do is feed you. Come inside." Bishop wiped his hands on a rag, looked back once at his own quiet house, and followed her up the porch steps. If a moment like that has ever happened to you, a small kindness that turned into something you didn't see coming, you already know exactly the feeling building in this story. Drop a comment and let me know where in the world you're watching this from, because I promise you, by the end of this one, you're going to wish you lived on Meadowlark Lane too. Now let's go back 3 weeks, to before any of this started, when Bishop Calloway didn't know his new neighbor's name, and Selah Monroe was doing everything she could not to need anyone's help at all. Bishop had lived on Meadowlark Lane for 6 years, ever since he and his ex-wife bought the house with the wraparound porch and the 2-car garage that eventually became his sanctuary. The marriage hadn't lasted, but the house had, and so had the rhythm he built around it. Up before dawn for shifts at Engine House 14, home in time to get Ren to school, weekends spent with his hands under the hood of a '69 Chevelle he'd been restoring since the divorce, piece by patient piece. People on the street knew him as the fireman with the good truck and the sweet, quiet little girl, and Bishop had built his whole life around being exactly that reliable, exactly that self-contained. He didn't date. He told his sister, when she asked, that he didn't have room in his life for anything that wasn't already there. Ren, the firehouse, the Chevelle slowly becoming whole again in his garage. He believed that, mostly. He'd believed it for 3 years, ever since the house had gone quiet in a way it never used to be. Selah Monroe moved into the house at the end of the cul-de-sac in early spring, driving a moving truck herself because she'd been too proud, or too tired, to ask anyone for help. She taught middle school choir 2 towns over, a job she loved fiercely even on the days it exhausted her completely, and she drove her grandmother's old Buick to get there, the same car her grandmother had taught her to drive in, the same car that still smelled faintly of the lavender sachets Grandma Ruth used to keep in the glove box. Selah could have afforded something newer. She'd been told as much, more than once, by well-meaning friends who didn't understand that some things weren't about what made sense. She kept the Buick running through sheer stubbornness and a growing list of small mechanical problems she didn't have the money or the time to properly fix, telling herself every week that she'd deal with it eventually. She kept to herself on Meadowlark Lane, polite but distant, the kind of neighbor who waved from her porch and nothing more, because the last time she'd let herself lean on someone, it had cost her more than she was willing to risk again. For those first 3 weeks, Bishop and Selah existed on entirely separate tracks of the same short street, his mornings loud with Ren's chatter and the Chevelle's engine turning over in fits and starts, hers quiet except for the choir music drifting faintly from her open windows in the evenings. He noticed her, the way anyone might notice a new neighbor, nothing more than that, noticed the Buick struggling a little more each week, noticed she was always alone, noticed she waved but never quite stopped to talk. Selah noticed him too, though she'd have denied it if asked, noticed the way he crouched down to Ren's height every single time his daughter had something to say, noticed the steady, unhurried way he moved through his own yard like a man who had nowhere he needed to rush off to. Neither of them thought much of it. Neither of them expected that a dying transmission belt on an ordinary Saturday morning was about to change the shape of both their quiet, careful lives. The first time Bishop actually spoke to Selah beyond a driveway wave was on a gray Tuesday morning, 7:40 sharp, when the Buick refused to turn over at all and she was standing beside it in the middle of her driveway with her keys still in her hand, staring at the hood like it might apologize. Bishop was loading Wren's booster seat into his truck for the school run when he heard the engine click and die again, and he recognized the particular kind of stillness that came over a person when they were doing math they didn't like the answer to: rent, groceries, whatever a tow and a repair might cost against whatever was actually in her account. He didn't think twice before walking over. "Pop the hood," he said, and Selah looked up at him with an expression caught somewhere between relief and reluctance, the look of someone who had gotten very good at not needing anyone and wasn't sure how to stop mid-habit. She popped the hood anyway. Some pride, Bishop was learning, mattered less than getting to work on time. It took him 4 minutes to diagnose a dead battery connection and another 2 to jump it clean using cables he kept in his own truck for exactly this kind of morning, and in those 6 minutes, standing close enough to see the tired crease between her eyebrows, Bishop learned more about Selah Monroe than 3 weeks of driveway waves had told him. She taught choir at a middle school 2 towns over, a fact she mentioned almost apologetically, like she expected him to ask why a grown woman got that excited about 7th graders singing off-key. She didn't apologize for the Buick, though, not exactly. When he mentioned, gently, that the whole electrical system probably needed a real look, she said, "It was my grandmother's," in a tone that closed the subject as firmly as it opened it. Bishop recognized that tone. He had a garage full of reasons why some things stayed even when they stopped making practical sense. Wren, 6 years old and constitutionally incapable of staying quiet in the back seat for longer than 90 seconds, rolled her window down halfway through the jump start and announced to Selah that her daddy could fix basically anything, which was, according to Wren, a scientific fact. Selah laughed, really laughed, for the first time since Bishop had known her existed, and crouched down slightly to Wren's window to ask her name properly, like the introduction actually mattered to her. Bishop watched that exchange longer than he meant to. He'd spent 3 years protecting his daughter from becoming attached to women who wouldn't stay, careful and deliberate about who got close enough to matter to Wren at all, and something about the easy, unhurried way Selah talked to his daughter, no performance in it, no adult talking down to a child, made him quietly reconsider a rule he hadn't examined in a long time. The Buick started. Selah made it to work 12 minutes late, which her principal forgave without much fuss, and Bishop drove Wren to school, turning the last 6 minutes over in his head more than the situation probably warranted. That evening, he found himself out in his own driveway later than usual, ostensibly checking the Chevelle's timing belt, actually just present in case Selah's porch light came on and she happened to step outside. It did. She did. They ended up talking across the low hedge between their yards for almost 45 minutes about nothing consequential: her students, his firehouse shifts, the specific stubbornness required to keep a 12-year-old car alive out of sentiment alone. And when she finally said goodnight, Bishop noticed that the conversation had ended too soon, which was not a thought he'd let himself have about anyone in 3 years. Over the 2 weeks that followed, small moments accumulated the way they do before either person notices the pattern forming. Selah started leaving before Bishop most mornings, but not before a wave that lingered a beat longer than the ones before. Wren adopted Selah into her personal orbit with the total confidence of a child who had decided something was true before the adults caught up, asking, more than once, if Miss Selah could come to her school's spring concert, a question Bishop deflected without quite saying no. And underneath the small talk and the driveway waves, the Buick kept struggling, the belt Bishop had noticed that first morning fraying a little more with every cold start, until both of them understood, without saying it aloud, that it was only a matter of time before it gave out completely, and that whatever this was building toward, the fence just wasn't going to hold much longer. If you've ever watched something quietly become important to you before you were ready to admit it, you know exactly what's building here, and if you want to see where Bishop and Selah end up, make sure you're subscribed, because chapter after chapter, this one only gets harder to look away from. The belt finally snapped on a Saturday morning 3 weeks after the jump start, the same kind of soft, gray gold morning that seemed to follow Bishop and Selah around without either of them arranging it. Selah heard the engine cough, stutter, and die with a note of finality that told her, before she even got out of the car, that this wasn't something a jump would fix. She sat in the driver's seat for a long moment with her hands still on the wheel, and when she finally stepped out, Bishop was already crossing his own yard toward her. Wren's abandoned bicycle tipped over in the grass behind him, where she'd left it mid-ride. "Don't tell me," he said, not unkindly, and Selah laughed despite herself, the tired kind of laugh that came from watching something inevitable finally happen. He didn't ask if she wanted help. He just rolled his sleeves up, the same unhurried certainty he'd brought to the jumpstart weeks earlier, and told her to go make coffee if she wanted to be useful. It took him the better part of 2 hours, flat on his back on a creeper board he'd dragged over from his own garage, tracing the dead belt back to a battery connection corroded past saving underneath a layer of grime that told him nobody had touched this engine properly in years. Selah brought him sweet tea instead of coffee once the sun climbed high enough to make coffee feel wrong, and stood over him in the driveway watching his hands work with a kind of quiet, close attention she hadn't let herself give anyone in a long while. When he finally slid out from under the car, grease streaked up one forearm and a small, satisfied look on his face that told her the Buick would start again, she found herself saying the thing before she'd fully decided to say it. "You've been out here 2 hours. Least I can do is feed you properly. Come inside." Bishop looked back once at his own quiet house, at the Chevelle waiting patiently in his garage, and understood that saying yes to this particular invitation was going to mean something different than saying yes to sweet tea in a driveway. He wiped his hands on a rag anyway, and followed her up the porch steps into a house he'd never once been inside in 6 years of living 40 feet away. Selah's kitchen surprised him, not the size of it or the state of it, but the warmth, photographs covering nearly every inch of the refrigerator and one entire wall, most of them featuring an older woman with Selah's same steady eyes. "My grandmother," Selah said, following his gaze while she pulled ingredients out of the fridge with practiced efficiency. "Ruth. She's who taught me to drive in that car you just spent 2 hours saving." She told him, in pieces while she cooked, about growing up 2 states away in her grandmother's care after her mother left when she was 9. About Ruth's insistence that a woman ought to know how to change her own oil and balance her own checkbook and never, under any circumstances, wait around for someone else to fix what she could learn to fix herself. It explained, Bishop thought, watching her move confidently around the kitchen that was entirely her own domain, why asking for help with the Buick had cost her something, and why she'd asked anyway. He told her about Wren's mother in return, not the whole of it, just enough. That the marriage had ended amicably enough as these things went, that Wren split time evenly between 2 homes that both genuinely loved her, that the hardest part hadn't been the divorce itself but the quiet after, learning how to build a full life around a half-empty house. Selah listened the way he noticed she listened to Wren weeks earlier, no performance in it, nothing rushed, just steady attention that made him say more than he'd planned to. Somewhere between the story and the meal she'd put together almost without seeming to try, the space between them at her small kitchen table had closed without either of them tracking exactly when. His hand rested near hers on the table's edge. Neither of them moved it away. The moment might have gone further. Bishop would think about this later, replaying it more than a grown man probably should, except that his phone buzzed with a text from Wren's after-school program asking if he was still coming to pick her up for the Saturday enrichment class, and in the same breath Selah's oven timer went off for something she'd forgotten she was baking. And the 2 interruptions landed on top of each other with a timing so precise it almost felt engineered by some force. Either of them controlled. They both laughed, the tension breaking into something lighter but no less charged, and Bishop stood to leave with far more reluctance than the situation strictly called for. At the door, Selah told him, quiet and a little surprised at her own boldness, that he was welcome back any time the Buick decided to act up again, and Bishop, halfway down her porch steps, found himself already hoping, against every ounce of caution he'd built over 3 careful years, that it would. The weeks after that first dinner unfolded in a rhythm neither Bishop nor Selah had planned, but both found themselves protecting fiercely. The Buick, fully repaired and running better than it had in years, no longer gave either of them an excuse to cross the low hedge between their yards, and yet they kept finding their way over anyway. Selah started staying late at Wren's Tuesday enrichment pickups just to catch Bishop before his shift, claiming she was heading that direction regardless. A lie so thin neither of them bothered pretending to believe it. Bishop, for his part, began timing his evening walks to the exact hour Selah usually sat out on her porch grading papers, coffee in hand, porch light glowing against the early dark. Wren noticed before either adult admitted anything out loud, announcing at dinner one night with the flat confidence only a 6-year-old could manage that Miss Selah was going to be at her spring concert. "Because I already asked her and she said yes." Which was how Bishop learned his daughter had quietly arranged his love life without consulting him. The concert itself became the first time the three of them existed together in public as something that looked, to anyone watching, like a family unit rather than three separate lives that happened to overlap. Selah sat beside Bishop in a folding chair in the school gymnasium, cheering loud enough during Wren's solo that the woman next to her laughed and asked if she was the mom, and Selah hesitated exactly one beat too long before saying, simply, "Neighbor," in a tone that suggested even she wasn't fully convinced anymore. Afterward, Wren ran straight to Selah before she ran to her own father, arms out, completely unself-conscious about it, and something about watching his daughter choose Selah so easily, so naturally, undid a piece of the careful control Bishop had kept wrapped around his heart for 3 years. He caught Selah's eye over Wren's head. Neither of them looked away first. They ended up back at Selah's kitchen table that night after Wren had gone to sleep in the guest room down the hall, the concert's adrenaline slowly settling into something quieter and more honest. Selah poured them both wine she rarely opened for anyone, and somewhere between the second glass and the comfortable silence that followed, she told him the rest of what she hadn't said the first time, about the engagement that ended 2 years earlier, not with betrayal but with a slow, humiliating realization that she'd spent 4 years making herself smaller and more convenient for a man who never once considered rearranging his own life for hers. "I promised myself I wouldn't be anybody's afterthought again," she said, turning her wine glass slowly on the table. "Even a good one." Bishop understood, hearing that, exactly why she kept her grandmother's stubborn old car instead of something practical, why she'd waved from her porch for 3 weeks instead of walking over. Some caution wasn't fear. It was self-respect, hard-won. He told her, in return, about the year after his divorce when he nearly let himself believe the same thing about love that she clearly believed, that it always eventually cost you the parts of yourself you couldn't get back. He told her about building the Chevelle piece by piece not because he needed another car, but because it was the one thing in his life he could take completely apart and trust himself to put back together correctly, unlike the marriage he hadn't been able to save. Selah reached across the table this time, no interruption coming to save either of them from the moment, and covered his hand with hers. "I don't think you're taking anything apart right now," she said quietly. "I think you're just scared to let something stay whole." Bishop didn't have an answer for that. He didn't try to find one. He leaned across the small kitchen table instead, and this time, nothing stopped him. No phone, no timer, nothing but the quiet certainty that had been building in both of them for weeks, and kissed her. If you've ever had a moment like that, the one where all the careful walls you build stop mattering all at once, you know exactly what Bishop and Selah are feeling right now, and there's still more of this story left to unfold. Subscribe now so you don't miss where they go from here, because chapter after chapter, this one only gets more worth staying for. The trouble started 3 days after the kiss, in the ordinary, unremarkable way trouble usually did, not with an argument, but with a question Bishop wasn't ready for. He'd taken Wren to get ice cream after school, a routine Tuesday treat, and somewhere between her first bite and her second she looked up at him with the same unshakable confidence she brought to everything and asked, plainly, if Selah was going to be her new mommy. Bishop had frozen mid-bite, caught completely off guard by how easily the question had come out of his 6-year-old, how naturally her mind had already built the whole architecture of a future he hadn't let himself consciously picture yet. He gave her some careful, gentle non-answer about grown-ups taking things slowly, and Wren accepted it the way children accept most adult evasions, without pushing, but without quite believing it either. Driving home, Bishop couldn't shake the weight of it. He'd promised himself, after the divorce, that he would never again let his daughter get attached to someone who might not stay. He wasn't sure, watching Wren's face light up every time Selah's name came up, that he'd kept that promise at all. He pulled back the way careful men often do, not dramatically, not with any single decisive conversation, but in small, accumulating retreats that were nonetheless impossible to miss. He stopped timing his evening walks to Selah's porch light. He let 2, then 3 days pass without crossing the hedge, telling himself he was simply busy with a stretch of overnight shifts at the firehouse, which was true, but not the whole truth. Selah noticed immediately, the way a person notices exactly the kind of absence they've been quietly braced for their entire adult life. She didn't chase him. She'd promised herself years earlier that she was done chasing anyone who needed convincing to stay. But the old, familiar ache crept back, and regardless, the specific hurt of watching someone she'd let herself trust start edging toward the door. By the end of the week, her porch light stayed on later than usual, and Bishop's house stayed dark and still across the cul-de-sac, both of them awake, both of them alone, either one saying anything. It was Wren, in the end, who forced the reckoning neither adult seemed capable of starting on their own. She noticed her father's quiet distraction all week, the way children notice everything adults think they're hiding, and on Saturday morning she marched into the kitchen and asked him directly why he'd stopped talking to Miss Selah, not delicately, not tentatively, just the flat, devastating honesty only a 6-year-old could deploy. Bishop tried to explain, badly, that grown-up relationships were complicated, that he was trying to protect her, protect them both, from getting hurt. Wren considered this with the gravity of a much older person and told him, simply, that she liked being hurt less than she liked never seeing Miss Selah at all, which wasn't quite the argument Bishop was prepared to counter. He sat with that for a long time after she'd wandered off to watch cartoons, turning over the uncomfortable truth that in trying to protect his daughter from disappointment, he'd built the exact disappointment he was trying to avoid. He found Selah in her front yard that same afternoon, kneeling beside a flower bed she'd been neglecting all week, and she didn't stand up right away when she saw him crossing the hedge, some part of her still bracing for whatever conversation was coming. He didn't waste time on the careful, evasive language he'd used with Wren. He told her the truth plainly, that Wren's question had scared him, that the fear wasn't about Selah at all but about his own capacity to survive losing something that mattered this much a second time, and that pulling away had felt, in the moment, like the responsible thing to do for his daughter. Selah listened without softening the hurt on her face, because she'd earned the right not to pretend the distance hadn't cost her something. "I told you I wouldn't be anybody's afterthought again," she said quietly, standing now, brushing dirt from her knees. "You didn't even ask me what I was scared of. You just decided for both of us." The silence that followed stretched long enough that Bishop understood, with real clarity, exactly how close he was to losing something he hadn't fully let himself claim yet. He asked her, finally, the question he should have asked days earlier instead of retreating into his own fear. What was she scared of? Selah's answer, when it came, surprised him with its honesty. She was scared of exactly the same thing he was, of loving a child who wasn't hers yet and losing the right to love her if things between the adults fell apart, of building herself into the shape of Wren's life only to be quietly edited back out of it. "I didn't need you to protect me from getting hurt," she said. "I needed you to trust that I already knew the risk, and I was choosing it anyway." Bishop stood with that for a long moment, the late afternoon light going soft and gold around them, and understood that the only real mistake he'd made all week was assuming he had to carry the fear alone. The reconciliation in Selah's front yard didn't end with a single grand gesture. It ended the way most real repairs do, slowly, with both people choosing every day afterward to keep showing up. Bishop started leaving his porch light on again, deliberately this time, no more retreating into careful distance disguised as protection. He and Selah sat down together, just the two of them, and talked through what slow actually meant to both of them now, not an excuse to hold back, but an honest pace that let Wren settle into this new shape of family without ever feeling like the ground was shifting under her. Wren, for her part, treated the reconciliation as a foregone conclusion she'd simply been waiting on the adults to catch up to, informing her father within the week that she'd already decided Selah could sit next to her at the next spring concert instead of just near her, a distinction that meant everything to a 6-year-old and made Bishop laugh harder than he had in months. Over the summer that followed, the rhythm between the three of them stopped feeling like two separate households occasionally overlapping and started feeling, unmistakably, like one. Selah's porch and Bishop's garage became the two poles of a single shared life, Sunday dinners rotating between both kitchens, Wren's bicycle permanently parked somewhere between the 2 yards, the low hedge that used to mark a boundary worn down to almost nothing from how often it got crossed. Bishop finally finished the Chevelle that August, the restoration he'd poured 3 lonely years into finally complete, and the first person he took for a drive in it, top down, evening light gold across the highway, wasn't a friend from the firehouse or his sister, but Selah, who cried a little in the passenger seat without fully explaining why, though Bishop thought he understood well enough. He proposed in October, in Selah's driveway, in almost the exact spot where he'd once lain on his back beneath a dying Buick without knowing it would change the entire direction of his life. He didn't stage anything elaborate, no crowd, no orchestrated surprise, just Bishop kneeling in the same driveway at golden hour with a small ring box and the same steady, unhurried certainty he brought to everything that mattered to him. "You once told me you didn't need me to protect you from the risk," he said. "You just needed me to choose it with you. I'm done being scared of that. I choose it. Every day, for as long as you'll let me." Selah didn't answer with words at first. She crossed the last few feet of driveway the same way she'd crossed toward him that very first Saturday morning, without hesitation, without needing to be certain it was safe. When she finally said yes, Wren, watching from the porch with the specific triumphant satisfaction of a child who'd orchestrated the entire relationship from the very beginning, shouted that she'd known it all along and demanded ice cream to celebrate. They were married the following spring, in Selah's backyard, under a string of lights that stretched between her porch and Bishop's, the hedge between their two properties trimmed low and deliberate now, more threshold than boundary. Wren walked ahead of Selah down the aisle scattering flower petals, informing every guest within earshot that she had personally arranged the whole thing. Ruth's old Buick, fully restored and gleaming, sat parked in the driveway throughout the ceremony, not because anyone needed it, but because Selah had insisted it be there, the same way she'd once insisted on keeping it running out of love instead of practicality. Bishop stood at the altar in a simple gray suit, steadier and more certain than he'd let himself be in years, watching the woman who'd once stood over him in a driveway holding 2 glasses of sweet tea walk toward him now in white. Some things, he'd come to understand, weren't about being fixed. They were about being chosen, over and over, on every ordinary day that followed the extraordinary one. If you've stayed with Bishop and Selah this whole way, thank you, genuinely, for spending this time with us. Tell me in the comments where in the world you watched this one from, and whether you'd have crossed that driveway as fast as Selah did. If you want more stories like this, the slow burn kind, the ones that earn their ending, hit subscribe, and consider joining our membership for shorter, exclusive stories every week with no ads. I'll see you in the next one.